Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Desiree Jauge. Welcome back to the feedback session, coming back from the parallel discussions. And we're going to go through the different titles or topics that were selected. And the leaders of those conversations can please give us feedback. Let's start with land and poverty. Can we get feedback on that conversation, please?
Desiree, yes, Mike Dani Brandt. Might I start just by, on behalf of our panel, expressing our appreciation to Professor Maronsela and the Chair for arranging this. We certainly found our discussion a very rich and interesting one, and are happy to have been a part of it. So very briefly, the panel was focused on the links between land and poverty. Our resource person was Professor Elmien du Plessis from the Northwest University, general terms, but specifically the links between land as a resource and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals 1 and 2, so access to resources and addressing food poverty. And she identified three main issues with respect to land and poverty that she felt was important to focus on. In the first place, the question of access to land, enabling access to land as an economic resource. And she focused there on the redistribution program as part of the land reform process. In the second place, Elmien focused on the manner in which access to land is generated. In other words, the rights that are afforded those that are given access to land through the land reform process as a very important issue in enabling development and in combating poverty through access to land. Speaking particularly about security of tenure there, and with an obvious focus on land in communal areas and communal title, and the reform of communal title to ensure secure rights. And then in the third place, she identified as an overarching issue in this link between poverty and access to land, the problem of implementation of policies and of legislation. And she focused there on the recently announced program of government to make available 700,000 hectares of state land through the redistribution process, and the issues with implementation that have immediately sprung up there, with much of that land already being occupied either in communal areas on the basis of customary law or indigenous law, or even in some cases by people who have already been beneficiaries in terms of the land reform process. So those were the issues that she identified. In response, Annalisa from Agri-SA, our respondent, said in the first place, with respect to access to land itself as an economic resource, that in current conditions in agriculture, the problem for economic development is not so much a problem of access to land, because of the technological developments that are occurring at a fast pace in agriculture, and with respect to which South Africa is at the cutting edge, which mean that increasingly land is becoming less necessary as a resource for agriculture and for food production. So she problematized that link that Elmien sought to make between economic development and access to land as a resource in that way. In the second place, she said that more important than access to land in the agricultural context was the question of access to finance and the access to other forms of support, capacity transfer and capacity building and so forth. And in that respect, she focused particularly on the issue of partnerships, public-private partnerships, in a particular way. And then in the last instance, she also identified as a major issue the question of access to rights and security in rights to land as a precursor, as a precondition to sustainable development. But she focused very much, coming from commercial agriculture, on the question of title and transfer of actual title as a precondition to sustainable economic development. Now, to end off, in response from the floor, a number of remarks were made. In the first place, some questions were asked about the remark that Anneliese made about a decreasing need for land as an economic resource because of technological development in agriculture. A question was asked as to how one makes these technological developments available to farmers, and particularly to subsistence farmers and emerging farmers, and whether it was viable to do so. In the first place. In the second place, our rapporteur, Wandile Sislobo, remarked that in South Africa, despite the technological developments, it is not so that in the near future, in fact, the need for land as a precondition to economic development and economic production is decreasing. So he disputed that point from Anneliese. The second main point that arose from the floor was questions about public and private partnerships. Again, Wandile Zihlobo remarked that often public-private partnerships are raised as a kind of a panacea to all problems in a very glib fashion, and that one should guard against that. Anneliese Crosby responded to that the kind of partnerships that she was speaking about were practical partnerships at a small level between particular agricultural producers and emerging farmers, for example, and farm workers with respect to cross-financing, with respect to capacity transfer and so forth, so that it doesn't move at that general ideological level. And then in the final instance, some remarks were made about the question of rights and securing rights as a precondition to economic development in this context, and the focus on title, on an unreconstructed understanding of ownership of title as the only commercially transferable and commercially.
Very clear feedback. And as we move to the economic inclusion and well-being discussion, can we get feedback?
Hi, it's Lumkile Mondi. I was the facilitator for the economic inclusion and well-being. It was a very fascinating discussion led by Dr. Ntabiseng Moleko, basically engaging with both the National Treasury strategy around economic recovery, as well as the President's view around the economic reconstruction and economic recovery plan. And really, Dr. Moleko premised her arguments with offering an alternative policy, which was supported by about 7 strategic interventions. The first of those was really what she referred to as a decisive economic strategy, with a clear vision on how to generate labor demand while stimulating productivity. And then secondly, looking at alternative mechanisms to enhance productivity, where if South Africa wants to increase its gross domestic product, it focuses on boosting local productivity, particularly agriculture, exports, and manufacturing value-added sectors, with government playing a very big role. The whole stimulus package of about 500 billion rand, which had been presented by the President, and the 200 billion rand package offered by both the Treasury with the support of the Reserve Bank, that had not gone far at all. And therefore, there needs to be a new rethink around how the Reserve Bank can be used as an institution that underpins this economic recovery. The third issue, which was discussed as a pillar of such intervention, was the reform of really dealing with oligopolies in particular value chains, specifically looking at barriers to entry in areas such as the retail sector, the telecom sector, production such as land, capital, and as well as strengthening of labor capabilities can be improved. I know that the previous speaker referred to the land discussion earlier on. This didn't take much of an explanation in our group, but it was more on the factors of production, on how the transformation of those could lead to higher growth and productivity levels. The fifth pillar, which was discussed in the group from Thabiso's presentation, revolved around the adoption of technology to advance growth. As we all know that South Africa is talking about how we can move to digitization, specifically to support labor-intensive sectors and capital-intensive sectors, but using the fourth industrial revolution technology in doing so. So policies were presented which could kickstart investment, ensuring that human capital is enhanced while to invest on labor-intensive industries using technology within that intervention. The last but one issue discussed revolve around focusing on industrial growth path led by labor-intensive goods and capital incentive production processes that could offset the risk of technology adoption, suppressing demand for labor. This, in fact, attracted quite a lot of discussion in the post presentation, with the questions being asked that what's been the barriers, why haven't we moved that way? If we believe that we can have adoption of technology, but at the same time create jobs, and in that process address our problems within our economy. And the last issue, what we just presented, was on energy, where in the same way as digitization in an energy economy, it is necessary for South Africa to really look into transitioning away from carbon-intensive economy, ensuring that the processes on the global energy transition, which you see across the world, do take place here and directly affect South Africa's energy future choices. And we need to move very, very fast so that the country can move away from the minerals and energy complex. At the core of these 7 measures is a capable state. I think in the discussion, the issue of capable state became quite a very contentious issue, that if we could address that, implementation would be much easier. So that talks to how the state recruits, how we allocate our budget in areas where we can have maximum impact within a capable state, that through those implementing these 7 measures, we'll be able to really deal with some of the issues and bring justice into the marginalization of many South Africans who are trapped in unemployment, poverty, and are facing huge levels of inequality. Thank you.
Let me thank you again, Dr. Mondli, for your feedback on economic inclusion and well-being. Let's now welcome Professor Jonathan Jansen to give us feedback on education and training. Thank you very much, Dr. Mondli, for your feedback and those insights into economic inclusion and well-being. Let's now welcome Professor Jonathan Jansen to give us feedback on education and training.
Thank you very much. So we had Dr. Joyce Mageta as our initial speaker, and then the Joyce is the Senior Director of Student Affairs at Stellenbosch University, and then the respondent was Dr. Nick Spall, who's works in economics of education, also at Stellenbosch. So I think the issue of education and social justice came up as a concern related to less to policy and more to politics. In other words, it is fairly obvious in the accounts of the two speakers that we have a massive problem of inequality in education. It's very visible, and what COVID-19, of course, did was to expose those inequalities which existed, of course, before the pandemic. And so the discussion was less about, drawing up a laundry list of things that aren't there or the lack of things, and more about the lack of really political will, political drive to resolve these issues. And the issue came up, of course, that the concern came up that we are headed towards even greater inequalities than existed pre-COVID because of the loss of instructional time that, again, disproportionately is reflected in what was possible with fully online, even synchronistic teaching in the case of the 20% of privileged schools, versus at the other end, those schools that got nothing, had no contact, the children, with their schools and with their teachers. And so there are all kinds of compensatory measures that will be taken to make it easier for students to pass, which on the one hand, as the discussion flowed, came up, is understandable as, you cannot, as a colleague put it, penalize children for the year in which they were born. You just happen to be born in the year that put you in school during a once in a century pandemic. And so clearly it is the just thing to do to make sure that those children, those young people in schools don't pay a price for the accident of being in school at this point in history. On the other hand, if you're going to make it easier for students to pass simply as an empathetic action, that is reasonable. On the other hand, you're not doing the children any favors if they go through to a next grade without the necessary scaffolding, the necessary knowledge and skills that enable them to succeed, both in successive grades, but also in the context of higher education and the world of work. In the end, what was very clear to this panel was that under particular conditions, it's very clear that government can and does move to put in place the kinds of resources for uninterrupted learning. And the example given was the provision of water to schools. For 25 years, schools in the rural Eastern Cape, for example, just didn't have running water. Then suddenly it happens. So it's not for lack of skill, it's not for lack of resources, it is simply a lack of politics and a lack of social justice thinking that runs along the lines of, no child, my child isn't safe until everybody's child is safe and secure, and so on. So we concluded with a discussion that in French the word policy and politics is the same thing. And that was perhaps a useful way in which to conclude our frustration around inaction. And then, we actually did conclude with a discussion about what a policy response might look like down the road for mitigating the multi-generational effects as we see it of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We hope we can get a document of those policy responses that we can perhaps pass on to the rest of the participants. Professor Jonathan Jansen, thanks for your time. Another conversation that took place was on data analytics and poverty mapping, and Dr. Badi Lehohla was in charge of that one. Please give us your feedback.
I'm not sure if Dr. Pali is there right now. He asked if I would step in if he isn't. So my name is Barry Green.
I'm actually asking that you are stepping in, Mr. Professor Green.
Absolutely. If you could just please introduce yourself.
Okay, I was the rapporteur. My name is Barry Green. I'm the director of the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, which is in Muizenberg in Cape Town. Okay. And a professor of mathematics. So the facilitator for our group was Dr. Pali, as mentioned. We were privileged to have two resource persons. One was Professor Thuli Madonsela, and the second was Dr. Juan Daniel Oviedo from Colombia. And then the respondent for our session was Dr. Turgai Selik from the Wits Institute of Data Science. So in the presentation by Professor Thuli Madonsela, we thought about, she sensitized us to what, to a number of points, for example, beforehand about what its effect will be. And if we've got good data, we may be able to model and then base our decisions in a slightly different, or inform our decisions in a slightly different way. This has been seen to be used, for example, now in the COVID-19 era, in the health sector, also to some extent for education and commerce, but mostly in the health sector. So the interesting talk by Jean Oviedo was giving us some examples from Colombia. I should also mention that in the talk by Prof. Thuli, two pilot studies at Stellenbosch University were mentioned. The one is the SIAM study, which has been running for some time, the Social Justice Impact Assessment Matrix, and then populating it with a study in the Swartland with a mapping exercise to mine data and to plan its use while assessing the extent at which COVID-19 and relief responses could be made. In the talk by Jean, he drew attention to a number of key interventions and how policy was needed to be responsive and informed by good analysis. And so he gave us some city examples as well as some real current experiences using data science. In the respondent section by Dr. Turgai, he spoke about some of the things we have to be cautious of. Our prediction is only as good as the data we get and how relevant it stays. So data can often change over time, and if we use the same data and do not adapt our algorithms or our resource to make a prediction, we may end up with making wrong types of analysis. So this was well thought, was discussed in detail. Overall, I thought it was a very good session. I think Dr. Pali could actually add some more to this because he was closely involved as well. But there was a recognition that data science is a very important tool for prediction in the future, and that we are only scratching the surface at this stage in its use. Thank you.
Yes, I've been invited, Terry. I don't know whether you are allowing me to be invited.
Oh, absolutely, Dr. Lehohla. And
of course.
Unless you don't have the appetite.
Yes, no, that's fine. Yes, just to add to what Professor Green has said, basically the issue is, does social science apply the tools that exist in medical science and the like in the planning? So what is very clear now with artificial intelligence and all these other techniques, it's possible for social science to borrow from those other sciences, these tools in order to plan. But in so doing, we should understand that we are applying these things on society, and society has but an equal measure to tame the tools so that they are relevant, but not using modeling and looking ahead and looking at consequences and determining a path would be foolhardy. So these tools that are there, data analytics, are very crucial in terms of informing the future. And certainly the presentation by Juan in the case of for Colombia and in the current of COVID-19 showed how poverty mapping at a very detailed level can actually be understood and interventions implemented. So I thought I could just add that dimension. But the issue is these tools are here now and we have to actually use them. My own observation is that while we can actually look at modeling from COVID and so on, our tools for planning in the country are still very much backward looking. And I think this effort here can take us very far.
Absolutely in agreement. Certainly one of the most important conversations today as everything starts to go online and all sectors of our communities need to be able to engage with these conversations. Thank you so much. Let's move on to the next conversation about health, mental health, and nutrition. And for this, we welcome Mark Hayward. Mark, a very good afternoon to you. What sort of feedback do you have for us?
Good afternoon, Desiree, and good afternoon, colleagues. We had a very rich and interesting discussion, even though there was no audience in our parallel session. That didn't dim our discussion. Two presenters, Dean of Health Sciences and Medicine at Stellenbosch, Prof. Jimmy Volnink, and the MEC for Health in the Western Cape, Nama French Mbombo. So both people with deep expertise to talk on the subject of health, mental health, and nutrition. Professor Volnink went first and described the COVID-19 crisis as having presented an existential threat that has ridden upon existing inequalities in health and made all of them worse. And in his presentation, he set out in a differentiated way how COVID-19 individual health, on health systems, on mental health, and on healthcare workers and essential workers. Prof. Volnink concluded his comments by making the point that whilst we understand the financial constraints that face society and government, in his words, we cannot afford to be locked into a scarcity mindset in our response. And he quoted the UN Secretary General as talking about COVID-19 as offering us a generational opportunity. The question is whether we take that generational opportunity. MEC Mbombo's response was very rich and very practical, based upon the response in the Western Cape, which I think all of us would agree has been one of the best responses to COVID-19 anywhere in the country. But she put particular emphasis on addressing the social determinants of health. Again, stressing that it is the social determinants of health that have created us as a country with multiple disease challenges. even before COVID-19, and that COVID-19 has again ridden on those social determinants. She stressed the interweaving of issues of economy and health, and that we shouldn't look at those issues as if they are separate polarities. And then she said that in our interventions going forward, it's critical that our focus is no longer biomedical, which is what much of our response has been up to now, that it's necessary to work with communities in how we address COVID-19, and to make medicine play an important but second fiddle part to that. She also talked about the importance of working with labor and with healthcare workers in health facilities. Both speakers, part of our topic was mental health and nutrition. Both speakers agree that mental health has been terribly worsened in our country as a result of COVID-19, something that's borne out by the NIDS-CRAM report, and also that access to nutrition and malnutrition has worsened for a whole combination of reasons, although I have to say that we are not monitoring or degree of worsening in relation to either mental health or malnutrition, which is something that we should be doing. So just coming now to the recommendations, I'll pull out 4 in particular. One is the need, as I've said already, to put much more emphasis on addressing the social determinants of health, including the social determinants of deteriorating mental health in our country. The second is to make our responses to all health issues, and this was something we'd learned from HIV but didn't repeat in the first phase of COVID-19, people-oriented and people-centered. Linked to that, and this came up in a discussion about the adequacy of mental health care in our country, the fact that we're not going to be able to quickly create the psychologists, the psychiatrists, etc., that are needed for a crisis of this scale, and that we need to strengthen community, recognize and strengthen community resources for meeting mental health care needs, particularly people's needs for counseling and care and support. And then the last issue that both speakers asked us to stress was the issue of corruption and its impact on social justice and social justice in health. And that was linked, and it's to an issue that was just made by Prof. Janssen, that one thing COVID-19 has shown is that really it's just political will that stands between an issue and our ability to address it. MEC Mbombo talked about how in the Western Cape they've managed to build 862 bed hospitals, even though they were temporary, and how that was done in a matter of weeks, where normally it takes months to build hospitals, although that has to be compared to Gauteng, where we are still in the process of building 1,400 ICU beds, none of which are ready, even though the first wave of COVID-19 has passed, and it's costing the fiscus over 2 billion rand. So those were the summary points and recommendations from the rich discussion that we had amongst the 4 of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that feedback. Very insightful. Let's move now to a conversation about access to justice and the rule of law, and this from Judge President Judge Dunstan Mlambo.
Thank you very much, Desiree, and good afternoon to colleagues in the room. The discussion was very enlightening, I must say. It started with a reminder to all in the session that social justice and access to justice were both important pillars for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, whose main objective is to end extreme poverty and fight injustice and inequality. It was also emphasized in this reminder that Goal 16.3, in actual fact, which says, which deals with the promotion of the rule of law at the national and international levels to ensure equal access to justice for all, was an important and one of the main pillars of social justice, which is what has brought us all together today. So this was the reminder that the session started with. What then happened is we had Judge President Dennis Davis as the resource person, who then led us in a discussion about his views on the relevance of access to justice to the overall social justice agenda. The respondent was Professor Theo Broderick, but starting with what Judge President Dennis Davis dealt with in his presentation, he dealt with a number of issues. I think the first issue that he raised was when one looks at access to justice in its simplistic form, it deals with access by an individual to a lawyer or a legally knowledgeable person in terms of resolving a legal dispute through access to a court and getting a court outcome. That's the simplest way in which he described access to justice. But he then unpacked it to say access to justice actually was much more wider than just simple access to a lawyer. It looked at the Bill of Rights as we have it and the number of rights that you have. I mean, access to health facilities, access to education, access to housing, you name it. So he then mentioned that access to justice enables the realization and the vindication of these rights by ordinary South Africans, either as groups or as individuals. So that was the first point he raised, and then went on to deal with the actual difficulties that are there in terms of the accessing of justice properly. And the first issue he mentioned was the issue around existing court rules, that these were complex and were beyond the understanding or even knowledge of litigants unless they had lawyers. And this complexity in court rules led to the denial of access to courts by individuals who would not be in a position to understand and access courts because they don't understand the court rules in terms of which they've got to play the game in the courts, unless, of course, they have access to lawyers. He then dealt with a second issue which is linked to this, to say currently one entity in the justice cluster that is tasked with the issue of ensuring that South African citizens realize their access to justice right is Legal Aid South Africa. And he mentioned it specifically to say it may be necessary to look at how Legal Aid South Africa has performed and what it has produced and what its difficulties are if it is not able to deal with the demand side of access to justice in the country. And in this regard, what then came out in the discussion was that the main focus of Legal Aid South Africa is on criminal legal aid, which is more than 70%, and you have less than 30%, which is civil legal aid. Yet, the bigger need for access to legal services is in terms of civil legal services. So the third issue that JP Dennis Davis raised was it may be important to relook and prioritize mediation as an enabler to access to justice. What he was talking about here was that the quest that everyone wants to go to court and have a court deciding each issue is not realistic, in the sense that if you introduce mediation and target specific areas of the matters that come to courts, one will be able to decongest court rolls but ensure that people still get adequate and necessary access to justice for their matters. And then he then concluded his issues by talking about the judgments that come out of courts, right? To say one needs to also take a critical look at the judgments that are produced by the courts. His view was that judgments need to talk and inform the litigants and larger South African society of what the dispute was, what the law is, and how the court went about reasoning its way into the conclusion. In this regard, he was mentioning the fact that judgments need not be made complex so that they are beyond the comprehension of even the parties who are involved in those matters. So he was speaking specifically to say, when you address social justice in a larger context, and as it is enshrined in our constitution, in the bill, in the Bill of Rights that we have, it says, can we be satisfied that ordinary citizens have the ability to vindicate their rights and to hold government accountable to its obligations? What then happened is we had Professor Theo Broderick, who responded to this, and largely he was in agreement with what J.P. Davis was saying in terms of the gaps that J.P. Davis had identified in terms of access to justice. But an issue that really became topical, and it's the main recommendation, which I want to conclude with, is that this conduct or trend by government in terms of not prioritizing justice entities that will help it, and in ensuring that South African citizens remain having confidence in the Constitution and in the rule of law, is that government must go back to basics and not only prioritize economic cluster entities in terms of bailouts, but also must stop this trend of cutting the budgets of justice cluster entities, which can help it in ensuring that South African citizens remain loyal and actually uphold the rule of law. This became a very topical issue, but I think it's one of the main recommendations that government needs to relook how it goes about in its budgeting initiatives, that it should not relegate justice entities to distant cousins to the real thing, with the real thing being economic entity clusters. A lot more was discussed, but I think I want to stop there to say that was the discussion in the session. Thank you very much.
Judge President, we thank you very much for that feedback, which is very comprehensive. And I keep repeating this with all the speakers, that ideally we should be having this at some sort of document, because it's really such essential information. Thanks again. Let's now move on to peace and social cohesion. Dr. Willem Verwoerd, let's welcome you to the conversation. What feedback have you got for us?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for this opportunity to give short feedback on a very rich session. Our panel consisted of Dr. Mashai Wangola from Kenya, Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela from the University of Stellenbosch, and then also Richard Mabaso from the Ibumba Foundation. And what struck me was actually how, also in the discussion that followed the initial inputs, that there was this resonance between what Dr. Mashai was talking about in the East African context, the Kenyan context, and what we were mostly talking about in the South African context. And some of the themes that came through all the inputs and the discussion can perhaps be summarized as follows. The first is something that has also been highlighted in some of the other sessions, but specifically in terms of the theme of peace and social cohesion. People talked about how COVID-19, how the pandemic has actually amplified the lack of peace and social cohesion. And some of the ways in which this really manifested was the way in which the enforcement of the COVID guidelines or the COVID rules highlighted the kind of unreformed violence that is still almost endemic in terms of how the police tend to enforce regulations instead of working with communities. And there was quite a discussion around what is the roots of this, almost like the colonial heritage that has still not been properly reformed in especially the state security agencies. But then there was also a long discussion about how, when we talk about violence and the absence of peace, we also need to connect this with corruption. And this has already been stressed by other people, but that we actually should use the language of corruption as violence. And what it's doing to people, what it's doing to communities, and what it's doing to entrench the injustices that we still are faced with. And there was a discussion around, what is it? What are the roots of this corruption? What are the roots of the violence we see in the police, and that we see more generally also against women and children, and that we really need to spend more time understanding more deeply what those roots are. So that was the one strong theme. The other theme was really then, when we really talk about how do we strengthen, in the light of that violence, how do we strengthen peace and social cohesion? There was a strong emphasis on the fact that so much of what happened during the pandemic was very virus-centered, as has already been said by the health panel. It was very state-centered and very security-centered, instead of being people-centered and community-centered. It really raised the question of what do we mean by social cohesion? Where do communities and citizens and people fit into the picture of social cohesion, not just the state? And also in terms of peace, if we talk about sustainable peace, even within the context of the UN's understanding of peace building, there's an increasing awareness that we have to focus on preventative measures, not just responding to when there's already violence or the absence of peace. And that then opens up the whole conversation around how do we actually work together across, community and state divides. How do we make this a much more people-centered understanding of how we need to address, social justice? What does it actually mean to work together? And both in the case of the different inputs we got from the panelists, but also from the people in the audience, there was a strong emphasis on the need to strengthen civic education, but not civic education in the sense of just giving people information about their citizenship duties, etc., but actually civic education that becomes more deeply rooted in people, in a culture, in a way of doing, and a way of working together. And that also would then be applied to the retraining, for example, of the police, that there needs to be much more effort to try and cultivate more of a sense of empathy and understanding for what people in communities are going through, instead of, in the first place, just enforcing regulations and laws. And that would require very serious now have become comfortable with, but to actually deepen our bridging capital, our social capital, our trust and our sense of belonging together with a vision of why we should be addressing, these injustices. And that is the kind of long-term commitment we need from people in communities, also in South Africa, but also across the continent, and obviously including people from the state as well.
Thanks once again, and thanks for the concise feedback. We really value that. Let's move on now to the next conversation, which is climate change and environmental sustainability. And for that, we have Professor Linley Chiwona-Carlton. Thank you so much. Please give us your feedback. Please go ahead.
My screen, yeah? Is my screen visible for everybody?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, thank you very much. So thank you very much. And I have to say that we had a very interesting discussion. This is the climate change and environmental sustainability session. We had two very interesting and prominent speakers. Our resource person was Dr. Sakane Ngomani, and she gave a wonderful introduction and contextualized the whole subject of climate change and environmental sustainability. And thereafter, we had our respondent, Professor Oliver Ruppel, who gave a very in-depth and broad response to the presentation, but also added several other dimensions that highlighted and underscored the issues that Dr. Sakane presented. And we had a very wonderful rapporteur, Nolwandle, and this presentation is a combination of my input and in particular the rapporteur's input, and that is Nolwandle. And we had a wonderful audience whom I will show you at the end. So thank you to everybody that participated, and any omissions in this presentation, I highly attribute those to myself and the rapporteur and not to the resource person and the respondents. So please do feel free to correct where I do make any shortfalls. So the key messages in this session were really looking and addressing that climate crisis threatens livelihoods and food security globally. And this is underscored by other forums such as WEF, which is the World Economic Forum, the Paris Accord, as well as the Climate Convention, that is leading us all to take a deeper, look and understanding of these issues about climate change, and in particular when it comes to environmental sustainability. And to contextualize the whole problem, Dr. Sakane, made a very compelling presentation about how South Africa is at the intersection, really located in the drought zone. And these, the whole of the context of climate change then puts at risk many other industries, but also other livelihoods that take place within the context of the South African economy, not least tourism, for example, but even if you look at the bioeconomy and other sectors that are all, very much affected by climate crisis once it occurs. And she gave a compelling example of the crisis that we had and experienced in Southern Africa with Idaya, and how you had the whole Limpopo area as well as Mozambique not only being affected by the floods, but also that many people lost their lives and of course their livelihoods, and the loss of the nature of the livelihoods, such as the cattle and livestock that people were keeping, their crops, and that this is really at the heart of South Africa and the region as a whole. But then when you intersect this with COVID-19, it really magnifies these impacts. And so both the response to climate change and COVID-19 needs to be aligned, and not least when we're looking at the groups that would suffer the consequences the most. And that we need to therefore look at climate change as something that is about climate justice and accountability, that requires governments, to adhere both to international agreements, but also to national and local agreements. I think the issue of local understanding, and it tied in very well to the presentations that were given in the morning and in the afternoon about the role of academia, but also the role of different sectors, whether it's the private sector and others, and how we respond and how we look at climate change. Is that a factor of climate justice and accountability and governments being engaged? And in the presentation by Dr. Sakane, she also looked at how the fourth industrial revolution, in particular technology and innovation, presents opportunities. It presents opportunities because if you look at the world today, we're more connected than ever before. But at the same time, these technologies and these innovations come with challenges. We're looking at increasing energy use. We're looking at perhaps thinking more about what sources of energies are we going to be using. Are these sources, going to create other challenges such as waste disposal? Are these opportunities going to impact our demand for water? And what is going to then happen in terms of environmental sustainability? And how then is the green sector an answer or a key to these problems? And we went on to then discuss issues around the importance of partnerships, looking at those key messages that were just presented. What then is the role of partnerships between government and civil society? And one of the things that came up now here we had the wonderful interjections from the audience that we have. In particular, we had the audience that was representing civil society, such as Rotary Society, and said, one of the things we really need to think about is creating more of an awareness at a community level, especially bringing in the youth. And the youth here, not just having an awareness, like a once-off in a lifetime thing, but something that is akin to second nature, just like when we have to say, wash your hands, because washing your hands is good hygiene. How can we change the attitudes by instilling these types of behaviors so they become normal behaviors and are consistent with what we would like to achieve? And therein comes, how do we coexist as humans with our biosphere so that we have a sustainable environment? And that it is very important for everyone to understand what environmental sustainability is, and that climate crisis is a direct result or lack thereof of overusing and overpolluting whatever activities that human beings undertake. So with COVID-19, again, it shows us that, you cannot respond by leaving someone behind. You have to respond without leaving anyone behind. And that response should be just as much when responding to climate change. So back again to the bioeconomy intersecting with the fourth industrial revolution, that we do need prescriptive laws in the response action, particularly when it comes to waste disposal, improve the policies and the frameworks for embracing recycling. And all these require that, we call civil society to collaborate more with governments, especially when it comes to rights, the rights that are both enshrined in the Constitution versus the rights that are enshrined in the law. How do we make sure that these are speaking to one another, but also that they're aligned and people understand the constitutional rights versus the rights that are by law? And therein, we need to understand that nature has a value. Nature has an economic value, especially if we're looking at, the fourth industrial revolution as one way of succeeding in how we will develop with nature. And therein comes an even more important aspect, thinking about solidarity, looking beyond borders, cooperating universally, and linking up both in academia, NGOs, civil society, as well as governments. And I think we really spent quite a bit of time looking at how rights comes with obligations. So for example, if we're saying that you have rights to water, that right should also come with an obligation to protect the water. It shouldn't be something that you just say, I have my rights to water, or that these are my rights. But then what sort of obligations do you have as an individual, or do we have as a collective? And looking forward, we really emphasized, and I think in our discussions, both with the speakers and how they both responded to the inputs from the audience that we had, that we need to embrace the rights-based approach, especially increasing and creating awareness with young people so that everything becomes like second nature. For example, as we mentioned earlier, washing our hands as good hygiene. And I think many of us, now know that we were told during COVID-19, or there was this global response of saying, if you sing the happy birthday song while washing your hands, then you should have done away with, getting rid at least of the virus if you have soap and water. So perhaps we can do such things as well when we think about climate change and environmental sustainability. And this cannot be done by one or individually, as we also had in the conversation around the role of academia, that we have to stop thinking in terms of silos. We have to think more about having, as the theme of this conference is, all hands on deck. And all hands on deck means academic, industry, private sector, governments, civil society, young people, old people, rich people, poor people. Everybody needs to be a part of this solution, because the problem has been caused by all of us in some way. So when we look at the SDGs, SDG number 17 is all encompassing because it includes all the SDGs. It's about the partnerships, but it also includes SDG number 13, which is calling us all to climate action. And I really liked the final words from our resource person and our respondents that we need to think more about subsidiarity, and that is solidarity and justice. And we had a wonderful presentation just before breaking into groups about the different types of justices. And I think we should all reflect upon that a little bit more when it comes to climate change. And then think beyond borders, think about rights with obligations. Think more about environmental sustainability and not just about climate change. And I would like to thank this wonderful group of the audience, as well as our speakers, Dr. Tsikane, and as well as Dr. Rupel, and my wonderful rapporteur, Norwan Lemade, and Enkosi. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you. This feedback session has been providing such meaningful points and giving depth to these conversations. And as we approach the penultimate topic, politics and democracy, let's welcome Kaya Sitole, AC. Kaya.
Hello, everyone. I think ours was probably the most fortuitous of all the panels, because it did happen on the day that democracy and politics were facing their ultimate litmus test across the oceans. And I think we also reflected firstly on the primary question of whether politics and democracy have been entrenched or degenerated during the COVID-19 crisis. And I think in the South African context, the general observation was that during the COVID-19 crisis, it firstly became an opportunity for some of us to live for the very first time through things like the state of disaster, not just in South Africa, but across different parts of the world. And of course, it was a learning experience for some people. But then also what emerged was a question of whether politicians had then used that as an opportunity to perhaps creep in or entrench into some of our long-held civil liberties. And I think in the South African context, there was the understanding that, yes, there were some liberties that were worth sacrificing, particularly when there is a healthcare pandemic out there. So even subjecting ourselves to a state of disaster, that falls within the ambit of the acceptable. However, at some point in time, particularly when it came to the regulations part of it, there were instances where perhaps the basis for doing particular things, the logic and the rationale wasn't as clear to some of us. And one example that we kept citing was the banning of Woolies chicken at some point in time, where it looked like rationality was not paramount. However, another point that then emerged was the question of whether during that particular time, when it is known that politicians are always going to try and see how far they can push in really suffocating us, whether perhaps we had sufficient defenses as a society. And of course, the one defense could be the litigation and the legal system. And the view shared by the different speakers was that it looked like during that particular height of the crisis, the judicial system didn't seem to be on the side of the common man, in that the cases that were taken to question the rationality and the legality of some of the regulations, the state almost always won. And on that basis, it left a lot of lingering questions about just how rational the state should be in the exercise of public power. And unfortunately, far too many of these matters of litigation were championed by those who had a vested commercial interest in a particular regulation being suspended or being lifted. The unfortunate consequence of that is that once the state and those particular litigants reached a meeting of the minds that no longer threatened the commercial viability of those entities, then the litigation itself was suspended. And the most common example of that was in relation to FITA, who were challenging the tobacco a ban. And of course, for them, the basis for challenging it is not because they were defending some common law principle or some public interest principle, but rather it was because of the commercial consequences of it all. And of course, as soon as the state said, okay, fine, we are no longer going to pursue the ban, then the appetite for asking the question of whether this had been rational to begin with diminished overnight. And this highlighted the problem that we always have when litigation is as onerous and as expensive and as elusive as it is, in that in far too many instances, the only people with latitude or I suppose the appetite to pursue litigation are those that have the deep pockets to do so, which means that far too many cases of issues that need to be interrogated, where the state needs to be held to account on what it does and how it does, those matters never see the light of day, simply because those that are most affected, generally marginalized people, quite simply do not have the resources to do so, which is why the role of civil society and non-government organizations is as important as it is. But of course, we now know that the first casualty of COVID-19, or at least the first economic casualties, are going to be the institutions that are regarded as discretionary. And when we talk about discretionary institutions, a lot of civil society organizations are dependent on the benevolence of the capitalists. And of course, in a pandemic of this nature, where there's an economic fallout, there's going to be the inevitable, withholding of grant funding, CSI funding, which means that the very institutions that should be thriving, that should be better supported during a time of this nature, are the ones that are probably going to be worse off when we then look back and say, well, what is the status of the funding of civil society organizations across the system? And that is something that obviously concerns us a lot. There was also the question that emerged on whether nationalism then became something that re-emerged during the pandemic. And of course, this is probably based on the question of resource nationalism, where far too many politicians are now faced with the question of, should I be the one that is lucky enough to stumble upon the vaccine? Surely I should sort out my own people first before I deal with the global question. And of course, that is very clear in how Donald Trump started even way back in March in activating the Patriotic Act, which is a unique piece of legislation that enables him to instruct any institution within the borders of the United States to redirect its supply chain and its resources towards whatever the state at that point in time says they should be directed to. Now, of course, that is one piece of legislation that he could use. Even if it didn't exist, we suspect that he could have activated some other instrument to make that happen. So that type of nationalism that is premised on the idea that I have a domestic problem, let me solve it first before I try to become a global citizen, that is something that is obviously a big talking point that we saw over the past few months. And unfortunately, until the vaccine is found and until countries across the world are able to get back on their own feet, it is going to be the instinctive reaction of a lot of politicians to say, I'm only accountable to this constituency, so therefore let me fix this constituency, which may unfortunately come at the expense of the
welcome thoughts there. Let's move on now to gender and other excluded groups. And this is with Professor Amanda Goos.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to give you feedback. Let me start by the colleague who just talked about politics. So now we're going to move to the notion of the personal is political and what the whole COVID pandemic actually meant for women. So let's start just by looking at the title of this session, Gender and Other Excluded Groups. So we felt we needed to talk about excluded groups, otherwise it's just sort of like an empty category into which we put everything. And we thought that we need to work with the feminist idea of intersectionality and how people are differently positioned in terms of race, class, gender, and other identities, but also in terms of flexible and shifting power relations, social and economic relations. And what COVID showed us, that this is very much a reality in how some people were very differently positioned in terms of their access to resources, especially in terms of the great inequalities that we experience in South Africa between people who are upper middle class and middle class and those who are excluded from classes or not even in a class. So we thought about these intersectionalities, and our main speaker resource person was Siam Samai from the director of the Women's Legal Center, who spoke about the impact of the COVID pandemic. And that very often that what we don't think about, we thought about COVID as a national health and security issue, but we also need to think about it in terms of care and the role that women fulfill in terms of care, unpaid care, the stretching of care, and how they, due to either losing jobs or having been excluded from, for example, the benefits of the 200 billion rand that the government made available that went mainly to organized labor, you know, how women needed to cope with hunger, with food insecurity, and with poverty. And we also know that during this time, domestic violence increased, there was police brutality, and it created new vulnerabilities for women. That will continue after the pandemic, or even now in the sort of stage 1 of the lockdown. So we are actually quite blind towards issues of care. And I mean, if we look at women in the informal economy, women who are, for example, domestic workers, they are very vulnerable, and many of them were not registered for UIF benefits. So they're really struggling. Our one resource person was Professor Sandra Fredman from Oxford University, who specifically looked at domestic work and unpaid care work. And her argument is that the 15 Rand 57 minimum wage of domestic workers are below the actual minimum wage, and it's far too little for women to survive. So there needs to be also a rethink of what we see as you know, a realistic minimum wage, and how women are included or excluded from state benefits. Our second respondent was Joy Watkins. She's a senior researcher in Parliament, and she talked about the economic recovery plan. So if we think about social justice as also redistributive justice, then we need to think about how this economic recovery plan, and also in relation to the new midterm budget, how women are going to benefit, and how the government's priorities in terms of redistribution, how that actually are going to lighten the burden of women. You know, the government is following an austerity package and thinking about austerity measures, and that, of course, has very serious implications, especially for unpaid care work, and also in terms of people who are, for example, making their own food cooperatives, food gardens, seasonal workers, farm workers, and sex workers. So all of them are really have suffered under COVID, and it's not clear how the economic recovery plan is going to benefit them. Our third respondent was Advocate Joyce Maluleke, who is the Director General in the Ministry for Women, Youth and People with Disabilities, who also acknowledged that the 200 billion rand set aside by government did not really benefit women, and that the ministry has actually decided to engage UN Women for more resources to help with a huge agenda that's actually the exclusion of women from a lot of economic priorities. So what we see then is that COVID, that we need to think in relation to the COVID pandemic, what is redistributive justice, and how we deal with groups that are socially excluded and marginalized. And here we also talk about the LGBTIQ communities, transgender people, and specifically the disabled, because there were quite a number of questions in the question time about what were actually the government's priorities in relation to disability. We had a very good discussion, but also a lot of questions about, for example, how the government is going to implement the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, how that plan will be resourced, and how the Ministry for Women, Youth and People with Disabilities can actually be strengthened in the campaign against gender-based violence and femicide. So our way forward is that we think that, you know, we need to look at where poor people reside and how they can access resources is on the local government level, and that we really need to give a priority to rebuild local government infrastructure and to enable women to access that infrastructure. We also think that there's a need for public education and how to actually make people on the local government level aware of the resources that they can access through local government. For example, tender processes for just cleaning up the environment. Local government, people who can actually access municipal services can benefit from that type of program. What is also needed is better education to enable people to help people to access resources. And then I think the most important issue is the issue of care and unpaid care, and how we can actually, through the budget, resource and prioritize money for care work and women who are marginalized but still doing a lot of caring work. So it's about putting resources towards the women who are vulnerable and enabling them to access those resources. And we thank Martha Miller, who was our rapporteur, for doing a very good job. Thanks, Martha. Thank you.
Thank you to each and every one of you for your contributions and for taking part in this process. This feedback session is really reflective of the seriousness with which you approach these discussions with, and we thank you very much. But it's also indicative of the tagline, which is all hands on deck to leave no one behind in the post-COVID-19 recovery agenda. And with that, we finish off this segment of the day's program. Thank you so much for your participation.